All right, y'all, it is time. Just ignore that for a second. It is time to talk about Richard Nixon. It's time to talk about how he came to the presidency. It is time to talk about Watergate. So, it's time to talk about Nixon. Here are the terms that we went over in the first video, and also the list of can you do these. So, in the 1970s, President Nixon, and remember, he had run against Kennedy and lost, right? So he's back. He becomes president. He becomes president 2 times. So Nixon serves 1.2 terms, right? Because he resigns in his second term. But in the 1970s, President Nixon introduces many environmental reforms, many of which we talked about in the last video. Along with leadership on environmental issues, Nixon took the nation in a new direction in foreign affairs. As a presidential candidate, Nixon had promised to end U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. She does, remember, Vietnamization. He recognizes the potency of Soviet power and the increasing unwillingness of many Americans to pay the costs of containing communism everywhere. Nixon developed a new approach to the Cold War. His bold program redefined American relations with the 2 titans of global communism, China and the Soviet Union. And here is a picture of him meeting with Chairman Mao Zedong, in Beijing in 1972. And I want you to think about how Nixon's meeting with Mao reflected a shift in foreign policy of the United States. He went to China. I mean, listen, Nixon was a criminal. He made horrible choices. There's many arguments to be made for putting Nixon in the category of bad guy. However, let me just play devil's advocate for a moment. While he was all of those sort of nefarious things, man, if he had just not been a criminal, he was a pretty cool president. Like, he did some pretty incredible things. Think about what he does with the environment, how he redefines our relationship with China and the Soviet Union. So, Nixon is just one of those characters that is always such a disappointment to me, because I think he did have a talent for foreign policy, which his own ego, narcissism, whatever you want to call it, paranoia, gets in the way of his abilities. From his first days in office, Nixon seemed determined to leave his mark on the nation's international affairs. Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, remember, had focused primarily on domestic affairs. The nuts and bolts of legislation and deal making. You remember his Great Society. Nixon was more a man of the world, fascinated by global politics and shifting alliances. Johnson believed his Great Society would solidify his reputation as a great president. In contrast, Nixon thought his reorientation of American foreign policy would cement his legacy in the annals of U.S. history. And I do think it will. You know, in 100 years, I think Nixon will be remembered for both Watergate and his criminal behavior, but also his foreign policy. So his real talent and interest was in foreign policy. Henry Kissinger is his national security advisor, who will shape his foreign policy and his foreign policy plans. The Nixon Doctrine is also known as Vietnamization. It's this slow withdrawal of American troops, so Americans will start to train Vietnamese to fight against the Viet Cong, and the American soldiers will come home. He will start to slightly back away from world affairs in terms of military commitment, but he will engage in foreign affairs in a lot of other ways in terms of forging new alliances. He will oversee this transition to détente, which is defined as an easing of tensions, respect in a multipolar world. How do we coexist with the Soviets instead of constantly fighting with the Soviets? It's a little bit of a relaxing of tensions. He is also going to be involved in some CIA operations in Latin America, for example, in Chile, and then outside of Latin America in Angola. So the United States will still stay involved in communism in other continents, right? But he will oversee this process of détente. He says we must understand that détente is not a love fest. It is an understanding between nations that have opposite purposes, but which share common interests, including the avoidance of nuclear war. Such an understanding can work, that is, restrain aggression and deter war, only as long as the potential aggressor is made to recognize that neither aggression nor war will be profitable. Oh no, hang on. I gotta fix this. Let's see here. need this to build in. Well, here. Oh, never mind. Oh my gosh, I'm crazy. It did build in.
I do not tell you that the war in Vietnam is the war to end wars, but I do say this. I have initiated a plan which will end this war in a way that will bring us closer to that great goal, to which Woodrow Wilson and every American president in our history has been dedicated, the goal of a just and lasting peace. As president, I hold the responsibility for choosing the best path to that goal and then leading the nation along it. I pledge to you tonight that I shall meet this responsibility with all of the strength and wisdom I can command, in accordance with your hopes, mindful of your concerns, sustained by your prayers. Thank you. Good night.
So that's Vietnamization. And remember, he is also going to establish an economic relationship with China. And so let's look at some pros and cons of that idea. Pros would be that it creates a stronger front against the Soviet threat, because if the Chinese are economically invested in the United States, then they have an interest in allowing the United States to stay the United States of America as a democracy. It strengthens ties between both countries, economic ties, as I mentioned. It lifts the 22-year ban on travel to China for Americans. It forms a stronger bond between East and West and provides for a greater cultural exchange. The cons: it upset a lot of American allies who are staunchly anti-communist. It increases tensions just temporarily between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it eventually creates a rift between the U.S. and China over the political status of Taiwan. The United States had not recognized the communist government in China as the legitimate government. There are nationalists in Taiwan who claim to be the legitimate government in China. Remember, Chiang Kai-shek had fled to China or to Taiwan. But Nixon will visit China in February of 1972, which seems like an acknowledgement of the legitimacy of their government. He says, so let us in these next 5 days start a long march together, not in lockstep, but on different roads leading to the same goal, the goal of building a world structure of peace and justice in which all may stand together with equal dignity. Butchered that last line. This is his trip.
On July 15, 1971, President Nixon requested time on national TV.
The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States, knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China. Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China.
The effect was electric. The idea was almost unimaginable. The Washington Post said, if Mr. Nixon had revealed he was going to the moon, he could not have flabbergasted his world audience more. The Cold War was raging. In Southeast Asia, China was North Vietnam's ally, and Richard Nixon's credentials as an anti-communist were long-standing and impeccable. But in the fall of 1967, Nixon wrote a seminal article about Asia after Vietnam. Taking the long view, he wrote, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. In January 1969, in his first inaugural address, President Nixon confirmed his determination to change America's policy toward China.
We seek an open world. A world in which no people, great or small, will live in angry isolation.
On February 17, 1972, after 2 years of secret and delicate negotiations, the President and First Lady were on their way to China. Premier Zhou Enlai was waiting at Beijing. In 1954, the U.S. Secretary of State had snubbed the then foreign minister. Nixon wrote in his memoirs, I knew that Zhou had been deeply insulted by Foster Dulles' refusal to shake hands with him, When I reached the bottom of the steps, therefore, I made a point of extending my hand as I walked toward him. When our hands met, one era ended and another began. A few hours later, the president met with Chairman Mao Zedong. The 79-year-old leader was in frail health, but the lively hour-long meeting included philosophy, history, and banter. Mao said, "I voted for you during your last election." Nixon said, "I think the most important thing to note is that in America, at least at this time, those on the right can do what those on the left can only talk about." Throughout his career, Richard Nixon always reserved time for strategic thinking, making and refining extensive notes on yellow pads. In preparation for his China trip, he considered all the possible permutations of policy involved. What they want, what we want, what we both want. At the Great Hall of the People, the President and the Premier exchanged toasts.
Said in your toast, the Chinese people are a great people. The American people are a great people. We have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today. What brings us together is that we have common interests which transcend those differences.
At the end of the trip, diplomatic ground was broken with the Shanghai Communique. After covering the points on which both sides had reached agreement, they proceeded to detail their different positions on all the other outstanding issues. Nixon referred to this in his final toast to Shanghai on the eve of his departure.
That communique will make headlines around the world tomorrow. But what we have said in that communique is not nearly as important as what we will do in the years ahead. We have been here a week. This was the week that changed the world.
During a visit to the Great Wall, the president reflected on the purpose and potential of the trip.
And one stands there and sees the wall going to the peak of this mountain, and I think that you would have to conclude that this is a great wall and that it had to be built by a great people. I think one of the results of our trip, we hope, may be that the walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this or whether they are other walls, ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world. That peoples, regardless of their differences in backgrounds and their philosophies, will have an opportunity to communicate with each other, to know each other, and to share with each other those particular endeavors that will mean peaceful progress in the years ahead.
Well, goodbye.
After President Nixon returned home, Clare Boothe Luce told him that 1,000 years from now, they will say of you, he went to China.
And it's true. Okay, so Nixon's trip to the People's Republic of China prompted an immediate reaction from the Soviet Union, which had strained relations with both countries. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev feared that improved U.S.-Chinese relations would isolate Russia. Therefore, he then invites Nixon to visit Moscow. Nixon will go to Moscow in May of 1972, and afterward the president reports to Congress that he and Brezhnev had reached agreements in a variety of areas, including the SALT Treaty. It is a strategic arms limitation treaty in which they're going to pledge to temporarily freeze the number of strategic nuclear weapons that they are producing. They also pledge to increase trade and increase the sharing of information. In 1975, there is a more formal treaty called the Helsinki Accords, in which many nations commit to, quote, a respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And again, the SALT Treaty here, offensive weapons and defensive weapons, are both going to be addressed. It's going to limit the amount of nuclear warheads, nuclear submarines, ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles, so ballistic missiles that can travel far regions. It prevents the further development of ABMs, which are anti-ballistic missiles, to counter ICBMs. It limits the amount of those kinds of defensive weapons that you can have. Having eased tensions with the nation's two great Cold War adversaries, Nixon stood at the summit of his long government career when he was reelected in 1972. But less than 2 years later, he leaves the office in disgrace, the first time a president had resigned. The Watergate scandal gripped the nation and shaped the values and attitudes of government today. We've talked a lot about some of the environmental agencies that were established under Nixon's watch, and here are a few others, including the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Administration, which was established in 1973. OPEC is also something significant that we will be discussing. OPEC is a group of oil-producing countries in the Middle East that set prices for oil, and there is going to be an oil embargo in place that will lead to a massive increase in the amount of oil prices purchased from the United States. Just another wrinkle in this domestic policy that we're going to be talking about in a couple more slides. So we said that he is reelected pretty easily in 1972, but his victory in 1968 was pretty narrow. And so one of the things that he does is implement something called his Southern strategy. And Nixon's Southern strategy had to do with giving a wink and a nod to Southern racists by saying he did things like opposed busing. Busing is when you put kids on buses and took them to schools that were quote unquote not neighborhood schools. And a lot of white people were opposed to it because what busing was integration. And so he's trying to send this signal to Southerners that he would be supported, potentially be supportive of limited integration. So after being elected, and during the election, he pledges to slow integration without outrightly saying he's going to slow integration. The Supreme Court ultimately will have to order that Nixon comply fully with the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Nixon will oppose the extension of the Civil Rights Act, but Congress will extend it anyway. And it's his use of this idea of a silent majority, that he believes that the majority of the people in the country are still conservative, even though, the 60s had been such an outburst, so to speak, of counterculture. He believed that the majority of Americans were still conservative and held conservative values, and that those people would come to vote for him, even though they may not have been outspoken about who they were going to vote for. This is all part of his Southern strategy, slowing down these civil rights reforms, which I've mentioned. He will also shrink the size of the federal government. This is where we get the idea of conservatives being small government conservatives. He will roll back some of LBJ's Great Society domestic programs. He will introduce revenue-sharing bills that mean that states can receive federal funding for certain items, but that money came with conditions. For example, like environmental protections, etc. He will implement some welfare reforms. He will replace aid to families with dependent children with a program called Family Assistance Plans, but he gets criticized from the right and left. Just moving through some of these things pretty quickly. This is a 1972 re-election campaign poster of Nixon. And the election in 1972 signals that his Southern strategy is a success, and that there does seem to be a silent majority of Americans who want to continue down this conservative path. And people are also pretty impressed with his foreign policy credentials, with what he does with the Soviet Union and China. But it's all about to come crashing down. This is the Watergate building. So the Watergate building is where the Democratic the headquarters of the actual Democratic Party are held. Remember, Nixon is a Republican. It becomes the name of the scandal that will eventually lead to Nixon's resignation. So he does have major foreign policy successes, but he can't get out of his own way. There is a break-in at the Democratic National Committee, or the DNC headquarters, in the Watergate building. Here it is again. And two journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, begin to investigate this break-in. because the people who are bailing out these criminals seem to have some pretty big connections. And so they want to push and dig and see if they can figure anything else out. And all of these very interesting things come to light. These are the so-called plumbers, the burglars that actually broke in, James McCord, Frank Sturgis, Bernard Baker, to name a few. It eventually comes to light that Nixon is paranoid. He has an enemies list, and all politics are personal to him. And he is not sure if he will win re-election. And so he had advised others to break in and steal secrets. They steal secrets from the Democratic National Convention headquarters, the Democratic National headquarters. So these men, they break into the Watergate building, and Nixon says he had no idea what was going on. And as more and more reporting is done by Woodward and Bernstein, it is revealed that Nixon did know what was going on, was aware of it, and had condoned it, that he wanted the information that was being stolen by these men. The trial begins in 1973. Their trial, these men are put on trial for the break-in. Why is one of the burglars former CIA? Is the government somehow involved? That's when the journalists really start pushing. James McCord will end up cooperating and testifying in court. And then the last straw for Nixon is his lawyer, the White House counsel, a man named John Dean, who still goes on TV doing commentary even today. He testifies that the Attorney General, a man named John Mitchell, had ordered the break-in and that Nixon knew about it, and that once more, the entire Oval Office has a taping system that Nixon himself installed. And so the special prosecutor, which had been appointed, a man named Archibald Cox, demands that Nixon turn over the tapes. Nixon says no. They go to court. The court says, you taped yourself. You got to turn over the tapes. It's public information. And that is the point where it is revealed that Nixon knew what was going on. He attempts to get out of it. He directs the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, at this point, to fire Archibald Cox. Richardson and refuses and resigns. The next guy in line refuses and resigns. And then that becomes known as the Midnight Massacre. The final guy, the Solicitor General, finally agrees to fire the special prosecutor in charge of investigating Richard Nixon. It's a huge scandal. Earlier, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had also been removed from office for accepting bribes. And so now Nixon's vice president is Gerald Ford. Okay, there will be a new special prosecutor appointed. Tapes will show that Nixon had ordered the CIA to stop the FBI probe into the Watergate burglary. They begin impeachment proceedings, but Nixon will resign before impeachment can begin. So he is never removed from office. He removes himself from office. And Gerald Ford will become president. He says our long national nightmare is over, and he will ultimately pardon Richard Nixon. A controversial move at the time, but in retrospect, generally praised as the best move to keep the country moving forward.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As as long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion. That to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged.
Okay. So he does resign. After Watergate, there are some laws that go into effect to sort of try to ensure that nothing like that scandal will happen again. In 1974, the Federal Election Campaign Act will set a limit on campaign contributions. The Freedom of Information Act penalizes government officials who withhold documents. The Government and Sunshine Act means that you have to meet in public. You have to have open meetings where the public can attend if you have like 2 or more elected officials gathered in a meeting. And then the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 means that you have to disclose financial forms and restrict the government officials ability to lobby. It also creates the office of the special prosecutor, which protects them, insulates them a bit from being removed. To be continued.